Welcome to Climate Change and the Carbon Markets. This is a class at HKUST. I'm Professor Charles Bedford. I'm here today with my old friend, old boss, and mentor, Bill Ginn. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Charles. Good to see you.
Thanks for joining us. Bill's in Maine, although he looks like he's in a field in India, I think. Bill, could you, for our audience, could you give us a little bit of a sense of where you're coming from? So give us a little bit of your background.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've had a very diverse career. I've worked in the private sector for a long time. I have worked obviously for nonprofits with Charles in the conservation area, and now I'm back as an entrepreneur. Managing a series of investment around climate change that I'll speak to at some point during our conversation. And so I think we need all of those skills in order to solve the climate change that's facing us. It's been a great journey for me, and hopefully that diverse skill set is helping the world in a small way to the kinds of changes that we need to see in order to be successful in addressing climate change.
So Bill, you've written a couple books on exactly this topic, sort of how to mobilize private capital and solve some of the big environmental problems we have. The latest one, Valuing Nature, speaks a little bit to this. And can you kind of give us a sense? Early in the book, you really talk about kind of the pros and cons of putting a value on nature. Can you give give us a little sense of what those pros and cons are?
Yeah, sure. Well, there are a couple of different camps here who think about these issues. Some people would say on one extreme, I would say that nature is too sacred to be commoditized, to have a price on it. There are others, perhaps on the other extreme, that say, the reason why we have these environmental problems is that we're not valuing enough clean water, healthy forests, stable climate. And because people get to use those essentially for free, they overuse them. I think probably the truth is somewhere in between. Obviously, no one is talking about, harvesting trees in national forests. On the other hand, it's incredibly important that we don't just give away natural resources, and then we send the right economic signal to both conserve and maintain and sustain those things which are the fundamental enabling conditions for a healthy climate. And the most obvious example, obviously, is forests. Those are the lungs of the planet. We've lost about half of the world's forests to agriculture since the dawn of civilization. And the forests that we have remaining are under enormous threat, both from agriculture, because we have to feed people, but also because of larger population demands more resources. So the challenge is that if we eliminate the fundamental biological and ecological processes that convert carbon dioxide into oxygen through photosynthesis, then we face huge challenges in order of stabilizing our climate. So that's the role that natural forests play and other ecosystems play in our climate system. And we need to figure out how to incentivize people to invest in more than just cutting trees down. We need to figure out how to incentivize people to use trees to store carbon, to recycle carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. And a lot of the thinking in my book that you mentioned, and in really the conservation community, is how do we do a better job of creating the right incentives for people to use our natural resources in a sustainable way versus the often unsustainable ways that we are managing our resources today.
And you use some pretty compelling line of argument and some figures in the book about sort of the role of government, the role of the NGO sector, philanthropy, and then the potential role of investment, right? And this is kind of something that you and I have talked about for as long as I've known you, and which when we first met, I think I had no idea what you were talking about, and over the last 15 years, I've become increasingly an adherent of the notion that mobilizing the private sector to solve some of these problems is critical. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of the various roles of the private sector, the government sector, the NGO, the individuals, and sort of what the relative strengths of each of them are, and the potentials for adding to value to the problem?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, all three sectors are important. NGOs are important because they're advocates for change, and they can often lead, new practices and new ideas. Governments are important because they set policy, and they drive change, and they have the ability through tax systems and rules and regulations, the opportunity to drive change. And the private sector is incredibly important because, well, frankly, that's where the money is. The reality is that the money in the world is not held by governments and not held by NGOs. In fact, some studies suggest that, they're really only 10 or 15% of the pie, if you will, that's investing around climate change. The vast majority of the dollars that are out there that could be mobilized to change the way we manage our ecosystems and solve our climate problems are in the private sector. And so it's, just plain foolish to think that, well, NGOs are going to solve this problem or government can do it alone, because it's just simply not in their power, either financially or because decisions are made, by individuals. And that's largely the economic system of the world. And so we need all those cylinders to be working together in order to solve this problem. But if you follow the money's in the private sector. So figuring out how to incentivize them to make those investments. So, here's a simple problem. How do you incentivize forest companies to not cut all their trees down and convert it to agriculture? From a income maximization perspective, monetizing all that economic value in those trees as fast as you possibly can is what's happening in places like Indonesia and Latin America and elsewhere. People are incentivized because what's their revenue stream? It's the sale of timber. So you're incentivized to cut trees as fast as you can from an economic perspective. So how do you change that? Well, that's where the thinking is. How do you try to create different kinds of incentives? Well, enter the modern thinking about paying people to store carbon, retaining trees as for their ecological services. And so all the thought about carbon taxes, carbon funds, and the like is trying to solve this fundamental problem. Is how do you incentivize the private sector to do something different than maybe they've been doing for the last 100 years?
Well, I think that's your argument on the forests is a really powerful one because it's so tied to climate, and forests are the lungs of the planet and the carbon store of the planet. One of the mechanisms, which we'll talk about later in the course, is the RED mechanism, which is reducing deforestation through essentially ecosystem service payments. There's a great quote that I read today from S&P Platts analysis of the carbon markets, quoting a developer who said, with RED credits now priced at about $15 a ton, we have a way to convince landowners to set up projects. A further price increase would be helpful. a further price increase would make red projects in the Brazilian Amazon fully competitive against kettle farming, for example. So it's really an interesting time, I think, to see sort of some of these this combination of the government incentives and the private sector investment teaming up to actually make conservation of the forests competitive with tearing them down. It's something that I didn't think I would ever see, and which you and I spent a lot of our careers trying to raise philanthropic capital for. How do you think this is a trend that's going to continue? Do you think that the carbon markets and and incentives like the red system, is that something that's got a future, or is it is it likely to end in tears as it did in the early part of the decade?
Yeah, well, it's a challenging topic because there's a lot of equity and fairness issues and global politics tied up in these issues. If you're a poor farmer in Indonesia or in the Amazon in, say, Brazil, and what you hear is those rich people in America or big emitters like China, you want us to stay impoverished and not monetize the value in our natural resources the way you did in China, the way you did it in America, the way you did in Europe. And we want to feed our families. And so, it's all well and good to say that for the sake of the world, you need to save the forests in Indonesia and the forests in Brazil. But what's in it for us? We understand what it's in for you who live, in the coastal cities like Hong Kong and New York and elsewhere. You're trying to save your skin, but it's on our back. And so the challenge here is to figure out a way to make that not true, to incentivize and to offer an economic proposition to someone in Indonesia and Brazil that makes economic sense for them, that's also good for the climate. And that's essentially, transferring money from those that generate carbon pollution to those who could, if they continue to do the work of maintaining their ecosystems, be the absorbers, the treaters, if you will, of that carbon. So, the best thinking about that is carbon markets as the way to achieve that kind of parity. And you have an economic proposition that, is efficient and potentially effective because it's a pay as you go system. I will pay money to Indonesia, I will pay money to Brazil or to you, a farmer, but only if you actually do the work. And that's a different mentality than, say, poverty alleviation or aid programs, which are focused on, providing food and, those kinds of things. This is really a different kind of beast. It's an economic proposition that says we're prepared to reward you, not for cutting your trees down, but for sustaining and managing them more sustainably. So the hunt's on for that solution. But those equity issues have really been difficult and have undermined so much of the debate on these issues, because poor people around the world are saying, well, you want us to sell our forests to you for carbon, and is that payment enough? And you want to buy low, you want to buy cheap. And we don't want to sell cheap. We want to sell, what the real value is. So figuring out that balance here, and the debate between indigenous people and the developed world has made it very hard to get these kinds of innovative carbon markets really going and be transparent and effective.
Right. It kind of gets back to your earlier point about the sort of the spectrum of people who view this is a purely economic problem, and that You should put value on all these natures, and the other end of the spectrum, people who view it this as kind of a sacred, inherent value proposition. Yeah, super interesting, and it's a dynamic time, and we've seen a lot of change in just the last few years, in particular around sort of the ESG sector, impact investments, and you've even 15 years ago, Bill, you were an optimist. You must be much more optimistic even now to see the kind of progress, especially. I mean, what do you think? Why is it the last 2 years in particular, 3 years maybe, there's been such a liftoff for people, who had been talking about this from the investment community, like Jeremy Grantham, who's a big, investor and environmentalist. But now you get somebody like Larry Fink, essentially almost talking like an evangelist on these issues. What happened in the last two? What's the critical mass or tipping point? How do you diagnose this?
Well, I mean, I just think it's become more and more apparent that this is not just some future problem that we don't, that next generation will worry about, but a problem for us today. I mean, you just can't ignore the storms. You can't ignore the weather issues. You can't ignore the drought and the pain and suffering that people are experiencing all over the world from a more erratic climate. And I think what's happening is that we're getting very strong messages from the world's ecosystems that we're headed towards a train wreck. And the business community, they greatly fear that, right? That's why Larry Fink's worried about it. He wants an orderly economic system. That's how he makes money. And if all we have is storms and drought and uncertain times, that's not good for the economy. That's not good for stock markets. That's not good for economic progress. So I think nature is what's driving this, really, and people are beginning to understand that this is not a future problem, but it's a today problem, and we don't really have a lot of time to make these investments because these are systems that have a lot of inertia in them. You don't turn them around in a day or a week, because you're building up stores in carbon in the atmosphere that will take a long time to get out of there. So, even if we magically push the button, there's a flywheel that's going to take us down pretty far down the path towards rising temperatures. So I hope that that's what's driving this, a clarion call and just a plain common sense recognition that these are like really serious problems and they undermine your economy. And that's why we have to get involved. Now, of course, there's lots of forces of darkness that are pushing against that vision. The coal companies, the oil companies, are look, they know that their assets will ultimately be underwater if literally and figuratively, if we're successful in dealing with climate change. And that's, that destroys their companies. And they're not very good at pivoting to new solutions. You would hope, and this is where one of the sad things about the private sector is that when it finds something it can make money on, it finds it hard to give it up. Mm-hmm. And so you've got, oil companies and coal companies and power companies that have a lot of vested interest in not having changes, and because they're making money on that. And so they're fighting against the reality, I think, that they're industries of the past, and that the new industries are wind and solar and geothermal and tidal power and the like, and batteries and all of those kinds of things. Just one example in the car business. You see the absolutely amazing situation in which Tesla, an electric car maker, is worth more than General Motors and Ford. even though they sell only about 800,000 cars compared to 4 or 5 million cars, each of those other big companies. And the marketplace is sort of recognizing that we need to invest in new technologies. And the old line businesses who are so wedded to the internal combustion engine are simply not doing it. But it's fascinating to see China, which hasn't had a huge car industry, being able to pivot more effectively towards electric vehicles, frankly, than the US, because we got all these old line Rust Belt car manufacturers who are just not capable of moving as quickly as they need to be, because they make tons of money on their old cars. And so we're seeing new entrepreneurs really change the way world works. And that's good. I mean, that's the economic system working, risk takers being rewarded. And in this case, an electric car maker being rewarded for being out there far ahead of the old companies that are now all of a sudden got religion or trying hard. I mean, Toyota, the world's largest car maker, for years has fought, even though they've been good at efficiency with hybrid cars, they've fought the vision of electric cars, but now have just recently announced they're going to be moving their entire fleet over to electric vehicles. So even they have now realized that they need to pivot and pivot hard. And that's good. That's an economic message going to the private sector. But change is hard because you've got all of this invested infrastructure. And if you've just built a coal plant that has a 30-year life, you don't want to shut it down now. You want to run it for 30 years. Right. And that's the kind of challenge that the private sector faces. And by the way, the reason why we need government and we need NGOs being part of this equation, because they have to be the advocates, they have to set the policy, they have to find the pathway forward to help migrate these businesses from the other direction. So the money's in the private sector. The role of governments is to figure out how to incentivize them to spend it in the right way.
That's a great way to kind of sum it up. And we'll take a break for a second. And I think the way you've ended that is a great natural segue to essentially what I think you've described as, my recollection is, the greatest investment opportunity in the history of the planet is climate change, and we'll talk a little bit about that in our second section. So we'll bid farewell to the listeners and join us for the next session.